Emulation has been a highly debated topic in the gaming community for years. Is it better than playing the original game? Is it ethical? What are the impacts on the gaming industry as a whole? The idea that you could play a game without even owning it, hell, without even owning the console to play it on, is pretty exciting. Why yeah, I would like to play Pokémon games on my computer, instead of a screen that was made to fit inside of my pocket. But when looking at the gaming industry and the community as a whole, there is a bit of ambiguity on whether emulation is actually a net positive or a negative thing. There are a plethora of different emulators, and I have never once struggled to find a game that somebody hasn't managed to put online. Hell, there are so many things available that I didn't even know existed. Seriously, who the hell was the target demographic for these things? And while gaming companies, understandably, aren't big fans of emulation, it's almost become just an accepted part of gaming culture that there is nothing that will stop people from creating ROMs of virtually every game that exists. While we will talk about the pros and the cons of emulation, and why I believe that they are overall a good thing in gaming, I'm also not advocating their use, especially not if it's one of these things. Who is even paying money for these games? One thing that basically all of the gaming community can agree on is that preservation is really important for video games. And as time passes, original cartridges and discs for some older games start to get worn, damaged, and lost. Many games will be kept safe in some museum somewhere, but for the majority of people, it starts getting tough to get your hands on them. Emulation might not be able to save the cartridge itself, but it can save the game that is stored on it, and keep it available for people to play whenever they'd like to. For whatever reason, a lot of game companies make it pretty difficult to play certain games. Nintendo are pretty notorious for this at times. Even with their online store, they don't always let you play the older games. And good luck trying to get your hands on the real copies of these things because you're gonna need it. We also know that these stores aren't a permanent thing that will last forever. The 3DS eShop closing down has kinda proven that video game availability is entirely in the hands of the companies that own them. So I guess go and give them all of your money for any game that you think you might potentially want to buy on certain platforms at some point in the future before it's too late. This is where emulation can save the day, especially for games that don't have quite as much of a spotlight on them as others, and so don't get put on online stores very often, or have many copies floating about. Emulation is the only real option to play some older games. Sure, there will probably be an original copy out there somewhere, for about 4 times the price that it originally would have costed, none of which the creator actually gets, but that just isn't reasonable for most people that just want to try out the game. I remember going online and trying to get a copy of Pokémon Emerald, since I was a bit too young and wasn't into Pokémon at the time, but really wanted to give the game a try years later. Immediately, I was flooded with so many copies of the game online, ranging in price from suspiciously dirt cheap to, oh look at that, roughly the same price as a Freddo. Just call me Jeff Bezos. I didn't physically have the money for an expensive one that was probably more legit, so like most people do, I resorted to a bootleg one, which would corrupt after about 8 hours of gameplay every time. The only reliable way to play games like this is through emulation, or sacrificing my firstborn for a legit copy on eBay, I guess. This is honestly the case for a majority of older games. There are some that you can pick up from the secondhand shops without having to spend too much, but even then, you have to make sure that you're getting the console to play it on too. And sure enough, you've ended up spending far too much to play a game that the original companies don't even make money from. Emulators save a ridiculous amount of money, while making finding old games to play a complete walk in the park. And this is honestly why it's often a gamer's first port of call when they want to try out an older game. There are also so many unique benefits of emulating a game rather than playing it on an original console. Aside from costs and availability of a game, emulated versions can often have major appeal because of how they change the gaming experience. Phone emulators can turn a console game like Sonic the Hedgehog into a portable experience. Hell, even portable games like Pokémon become easier to take around with you because of how small mobile phones are in comparison to Game Boys or DS's. Even for people that own the games and their consoles, emulators can make actually playing that game a much easier experience. I wouldn't want to have to set up an old console every time I wanted to boot up a random game for whatever reason, nor am I insane enough to constantly have every console I've ever owned set up and ready to play at all times. I wouldn't want everything on display all the time. My Wii balance board is for my eyes only. So even though I own Super Mario Bros. And the console to play it on, if there is an easier way to play the game, I'll usually go for that. And that doesn't even account for the fact that I won't need to use outdated and, frankly, shitty controllers. Instead, I can use something much more modern and comfortable to use, which genuinely makes the game so much more fun to play. Emulated versions of games can also change a lot of the content of the game. Some could fix annoying bugs that were present in the original game, or even fiddle around with balancing and difficulty issues. Both of these can make the original game a much higher quality experience. A lot of games can have a ton of dialogue that honestly just gets in the way when doing things like a speed or challenge run. And emulators are great for speeding through stuff like that, which helps to adapt the game for current players. But one of the most prominent things that emulators are fantastic for is modding games. One of the most enjoyable things to watch for a lot of older games are modified versions, changing fundamental mechanics to either give a harder challenge or to just shake things up a little. Randomizers for Pokémon games are extremely popular and so easy to do when using an emulator. It keeps the game really fresh while also having a much more heightened level of challenge and a bunch of laughs along the way.
That's trash!
The main moral problems that come with emulation are that, well, it's a way of getting around paying for a product. This is why companies like Nintendo absolutely despise it, even if they refuse to actually sell the game to us. The way I see it, hypothetically emulating a newer or indie game can cause some actual damage. In the case of newer games, the money we pay for it is what will fund the future games that company will create. This isn't a plea to help the oh-so-vulnerable game giants. It's more the fact that the only powers that consumers have is to support what we want to see more of by using our wallets, and keep our money away from things that we don't really like. It will also, of course, be a small part in keeping developers in the job. Now, in the case of indie games, there is a lot less room for what feels okay to emulate. I mean, realistically, Stardew Valley has turned one man into a multi-millionaire and has been out for 7 years. I wouldn't really get my pitchfork out for this one. However, some newer and smaller indie games, if they were to hypothetically be put online as a free alternative, it could potentially lose the small team of developers some money, which goes a lot further in creating games than it would for AAA companies. The reality is though, most of these smaller games don't tend to get emulated, and people often much prefer to pay their smaller prices for their games instead. Overall, emulation is, and has been, a really important part of gaming culture for decades, and currently serves as the main thing keeping some older, less popular, sometimes weirder, games alive. On top of preserving video games for everybody to play them without paying stupid amounts of money, they make life so much easier, give options for controls and controllers, allow for mods, and honestly don't actually take any money away from the companies that own it. So long as you do it morally, which basically everybody already does, emulation causes very little harm to the gaming industry and benefits so many people that love games.